concrete was still dark when Emmett Bracken came up the lane in the late August heat, and the smell of it, that raw mineral sweetness of curing cement laid over the older smells of cut cedar and bruised orchard grass, was the kind of smell a man remembers against his will for the rest of his life. They had poured it that morning. 3,900 square feet of stamped concrete, finished to look like tumbled cobble, $92,000 of grand entrance, troweled flat across the one strip of ground on earth Emmett had promised his wife he would keep. Camille Ostrander stood at the center of it in a white linen dress that had no business on a construction site, directing two workers who were setting the base for a monument sign. And she was radiant, expansive, the way a person is radiant when they believe the last obstacle has finally been erased. The heat shimmered off the fresh slab. A finishing crew hosed their tools in the ditch. And Emmett, 66 years old, sweat damp in a faded shirt, stood at the edge of his own easement with a phone in his steady hand and said nothing at all, because he had learned across 34 years that the loudest thing a patient man can do is keep quiet and let the recording run. Camille saw him and did not lower her voice. She told him brightly that the entrance was done and beautiful, and that his little farm road was gone now, a line on an old map, and that old maps, in the end, get repaved. She told him the gate codes would come by mail. And she turned back to her monument sign, pleased, entirely certain, not knowing that the man she had just dismissed had spent his whole working life acquiring, defending, and enforcing easements exactly like the one now buried under her $92,000 of curing concrete. Not knowing that within the week a county sheriff would stand on that very slab and read aloud, word by word, a recorded deed that would turn her grand entrance into the single most expensive mistake of her life. To understand how it came to this, it helps to go back. Not to the poor, but to 1936, when Emmett's grandfather planted the first 112 apple trees on the sloping ground above Halsey in Calder County, and hand-dug the cart track that the family would come to call Cider Lane. The Brackens were orchard people, unhurried and undramatic, and over 3 generations they turned 19 acres of hillside into a working heirloom orchard of northern spy and Roxbury russet, and a dozen varieties nobody grew anymore, reached by a single narrow lane that ran 7/10 of a mile down through what was then the Falk Dairy to the county road. In 1958, the two families, being neighbors of the old kind, did the sensible thing and put it in writing, a deeded, recorded easement of ingress and egress, 40 feet wide, appurtenant to the Bracken orchard, and binding on the Falk land and every owner after them, filed in Book 214 at page 61 of the Calder County records, where it had sat, quiet and absolute, for 67 years. Emmett grew up on that lane. He left it at 19 for a career that would keep him away for most of 4 decades. Right-of-way and easement work, first for a regional pipeline, and then for the State Highway Department. 34 years of acquiring corridors and examining title chains, and, more often than anyone outside the trade would guess, standing in courtrooms defending the exact language of exactly this kind of recorded right. He came back only when Meryl got sick. When Marisol got sick, Marisol had married into the orchard and loved it more fiercely than any Bracken by blood. She was the one who kept the old trees alive when Emmett's work kept them wandering. She was the one who walked Cider Lane every evening of the years they finally spent home, down through the trees to the copper beech she had planted herself at the lane's far end, where the hill opened to the whole valley. When the cancer came, she made him promise 2 things. And they were really the same thing, Mang. Keep the orchard alive and keep the lane open. She was buried. Her ashes were beneath that copper beech in the spring of 2 years before the concrete, and Emmett had kept his promise the only way grief allows, by walking the lane every evening himself, past the trees she had saved, down to the tree she had planted, and by telling her, in the wordless way widowers tell their dead everything, that the lane was still open and the orchard was still hers. He did not know that first quiet year that a woman he had never met had already drawn a line through all of it on a glossy plat. Camille Ostrander was 51, and she was, in her own estimation and in the estimation of every lender she had ever charmed, a builder of beautiful things. She had come up through luxury residential sales in 2 coastal markets, then master plan development, and she had a gift, a genuine, valuable, dangerous gift, for making people fall in love with a rendering. She believed that land had no story that a better story could not overwrite. that sentiment was a discount to be negotiated, and that every legal encumbrance was, at bottom, a conversation that had not yet found its price. 3 years before the pour, she had bought the old Falk Dairy, 340 acres of gentle pasture directly downhill from the Bracken Orchard, and drawn upon it Willowmere Preserve, Vita Bolsters, a gated community of 88 custom homes marketed to buyers who wanted the feeling of country without its inconvenience. And the centerpiece of Willowmere Preserve, the image on every brochure and the promise in every sales meeting, was its entrance, a grand curving boulevard sweeping up to a stone and bronze monument gate. The trouble, the personal insult, the thing that kept Camille awake in her model home, was that the only sensible place for that grand entrance ran straight across the 40-foot Bracken easement, and the widower who held it would not sell, would not relocate, would not even discuss a price. To a woman who priced sentiment for a living, a recorded easement held by a grieving old man was not a legal reality. It was a soft spot. She had promised her buyers that entrance. She had promised Ironwood Savings Bank, which held her $11.2 million development loan, that access was fully resolved. She had, by the time the trucks arrived, taken deposits on 61 of the 88 lots. The entrance was not a design choice. It was the load-bearing lie under everything, and Camille Ostrander had built her whole enterprise on the confidence that she could make it true by simply pouring concrete over the doubt. The pressure began, as it does, dressed as courtesy. The first letter arrived on Willowmere Preserve Community Association letterhead, an association Camille controlled outright, welcoming Emmett as a neighbor within our planning area and inviting him to discuss modernizing his outdated access arrangement. He declined gently and photographed the letter and the postmark and slid both into a manila fee folder labeled in pencil with the date. That folder was the first of 11. The second letter was less warm. It asserted that they owned for generations, that the association had design authority over the Willowmere frontage and assessed a nonconformance review fee of $400 against his use of the lane. The third came certified and raised the tone again, claiming that the 1958 easement had been superseded by the Willowmere subdivision plat and might be deemed abandoned for non-use, a claim so legally empty that Emmett, reading it at his kitchen table, felt something almost like pity. Then the paper gave way to presents. Survey stakes appeared along the lane, a confident orange line laid down, as if the easement were a suggestion. A pickup with a Willowmere magnet began parking at the mouth of Cider Lane. A young man's inside photographing Emmett's comings and goings, building a file of his own. The fourth letter attached a schedule of continuing nonconformance penalties accruing at $75 a day, and by the time it reached him, the invented balance already stood at $2,250, a number Emmett noted with the same neutral attention he gave the weather. And then, on a night in early July, someone came in the dark and pulled 40 feet of his road fence, coiling the old woven wire into the ditch, as though the lane and everything along it had already changed hands. The kind of small, deniable violence that is meant to say, without a signature, that the paperwork is only a formality now. He found it at dawn, and he did not call anyone, and he did not put it back. He photographed the coiled wire, and the tire tracks, and the timestamp from the from the trail camera that had watched the whole thing, and he added them to the folder. Through all of it, Emmett did the one thing his whole career had taught him to do, which was nothing loud and everything thorough. He photographed each stake and logged its coordinates. He mounted 5 trail cameras where no one would find them. In the crotch of a northern spy, under the eave of the pump house, on a fence post wrapped in dead grapevine. He kept the folders growing, 640 photographs before the year was out, and archives assembled with the unhurried patience of a man who knew that the case is not won at the confrontation but in the long, boring months of documentation before it. He said nothing to Camille about any of it. That was the point. His family for generations. 2 people were playing a game across that orchard, but only one of them knew a game was being played. And it was not the woman with the renderings, it was his old colleague Gil Marchetti, who finally said the quiet part out loud. Gil had been a right-of-way attorney for the same pipeline, retired now 2 valleys over, and he drove up on a Sunday with a cooler of beer, and read the 11 folders spread across Emmett's porch table in the long gold light of a September evening. Gil went silent as he read. He understood, faster than any judge would, exactly what he was looking at. When he reached the certified letter with its talk of abandonment, he set down his bottle and started, very softly, to laugh. Because he knew who he was sitting next to. He knew that He knew that Emmett Bracken had spent 34 years on the acquisition and defense of easements, that he had personally written or examined better than 900 of them. That he had testified as a right-of-way expert in 14 states and understood the law of appurtenant easements the way a surgeon understands an artery. He knew that an express, recorded, appurtenant easement, senior by decades to the servient owner's subdivision, could not be extinguished by non-use, could not be relocated without the dominant owner's consent, and most of all, could not be erased by the simple act of paving over it. That the improvement, however expensive, was mostly an encroachment the servient owner built at her own peril and would one day be ordered to remove at her own cost. Of all the easements over all the pastures in all the counties in the state, this woman had chosen to bury the one held by the one man, alive, most precisely equipped to make her regret it. She thinks she found a widower with a shovel, Gill said, wiping his eyes. She found the man they used to call as an expert witness when somebody else tried this. Emmett did not laugh. He looked down Cider Lane toward the copper beach he could not see in the dark, and he said only that he intended to warn her once, in writing, and then let her decide for herself how much concrete she wanted to pour. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already grieved. The warning went out the next morning by certified mail. 1 page, plain, unemotional, citing book 214, page 61, stating that the easement was recorded, appurtenant and senior, that any improvement placed within it would constitute an encroachment subject to removal at the improver's expense, and requesting written acknowledgement. Camille did not acknowledge it. She had, in fact, already made her decision, driven by a pressure Emmett could only infer and would later see spelled out in her own emails. 61 deposits. His family had owned for generations, a lender asking monthly when the access defect would clear, a spring sales launch that could not happen without a gate to photograph. She had run the arithmetic on the old man's patience and concluded, as confident people so often do, that speed would beat law to the finish line. And so, 8 months into her campaign, on a Tuesday in late August, his family had owned for generations. She brought the trucks up the Falk pasture and poured $92,000 of stamped concrete to the 40-foot Bracken easement, and she came in her white dress to watch the last obstacle disappear. Emmett let her. That was the thing none of them understood. The thing that made the audience, had there been one, lean forward. He did not stand in front of the trucks. He did not shout. He knew that stopping the pour would only have preserved her, would have spared her the encroachment and the exposure and the millions in sunk concrete that made her intent so perfectly, so permanently legible. So he let her build her mistake, and he filmed her doing it, and when she turned to him on the wet slab and told him his farm road was a line on an old map, and old maps get repaved, he got every word of it, and one word more. Because as the crew set the monument base, she added, gesturing at his lane and the trees beyond it, that the old man could keep his apples, but the access was hers now. She'd paid for it and poured it, and no judge in the county was going to make 88 families drive through a widower's orchard to get home. It's my entrance, she said, to his phone, to the sky, to the future. It has been since the day I signed, he just hasn't been told yet. Then she had her people install a steel gate across the mouth of the lane, coded to Willowmere residents. And for 11 days, Emmett logged each one. A man who held a 67-year-old recorded right of ingress and egress was locked out of the lane to his own orchard, and the tree where his wife was buried. Had owned for generations, those 11 days were the only stretch of the whole affair that came near to breaking him, and it had nothing to do with the concrete. Each evening at the hour he and Marisol had always walked, had owned for generations. Emmett went down to the steel gate and stood at it with his hand on the cold bar, looking the 7/10 of a mile. He could no longer walk toward the copper beach. He could just make out against the dimming valley. And he told her, in the wordless way he told her everything, that the lane was closed tonight but would not stay closed, that he was keeping his word the slow way, the way she'd have wanted, without shouting and without giving anyone the satisfaction of his grief. He never once raised his voice at that gate. He simply came back, the Supmek the next evening and the next, and let the cameras and the calendar and the county record do the work that anger would only have spoiled. That was when he called Miriam Kessler. Miriam was the Bracken family's attorney, a property litigator with a small firm in Halsey and a reputation for never filing a case she had not already won on the documents. She had handled Marisol's estate. She knew the orchard. And when Emmy had owned for Chenselshans, and when Emmett laid the 11 folders and the video files across her table and walked her through them in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading survey coordinates, she understood within the hour that she was not holding a neighbor dispute. She was holding a recorded easement, a documented 8-month harassment campaign, an 11-day unlawful obstruction, and a defendant who had narrated her own trespass in high definition. Miriam brought in the county, specifically Sheriff Wade Coffey, a plain-spoken man, 3 years from his pension, who had spent a career learning that most of the loud people in his county were bluffing, and that the quiet ones with paperwork usually were not. Coffey read the recorded easement. He read the video transcript. And on a bright morning 3 days later, he drove up the Falk pasture, walked out onto Camille Ostrander's $92,000 entrance in front of her sales staff and 2 prospective buyers, and did the thing the whole story had been moving toward. He took the certified copy of the deed from its envelope, and in a voice pitched to Carrie, he read them the easement. Book 214, page 61, the grant of ingress and egress 40 feet wide, appurtenant to the Bracken orchard, binding on Munt, binding on the Falk land and its every successor in interest, recorded the 9th of June, 1958. And then he told Camille Ostrander plainly that the gate would be opened within the hour and would stay open for generations, that Mr. Bracken's right of access was not in question and was not hers to grant or withhold, and that whatever she chose to do about the concrete she had poured on top of another man's deed was between her and the court, but the lane, as of this moment, was open. He waited while a work crew cut the gate chain. Then he tipped his hat to Emmett, who had said nothing the entire time, and drove back down the hill. The obstruction ended that day. The reckoning was only beginning, and it accelerated when the pressure inside Willowmere finally broke a decent person loose. Her name was Nadia Brandt, and she was Camille's land use and entitlement manager, the one who had run the title work and family for Reddichish, and she had been sick to her stomach for the better part of a year. Nadia had flagged the Bracken easement in writing the previous fall, had told Camille in an email that the easement was recorded, senior and appurtenant, that it could not be relocated or extinguished without Breckenmeg's consent or a court order, and that paving it would expose the company to removal costs and worse. She had been overruled. She had watched 61 deposits come in against an entrance she knew was unlawful, and when Sheriff Coffey read that deed on the slab, Nadia Brandt went home, copied everything to a drive, and 3 days later carried it into Miriam Kessler's office in a document box. What she surrendered did not prove overreach. It proved intent, in Camille's own words. There was the sales spreadsheet showing all 61 lots sold contingent on entrance complete, Q2, dated months before any lawful access existed. There was a buyer FAQ script instructing staff to describe the access as fully resolved and, if pressed, to say a legacy easement matter was in final cleanup. And there was the document that made even Miriam Kessler go still. The email chain in which Nadia had laid out the recorded easement in careful, correct detail, and Camille had replied in 11 words that would be read aloud more than once before this was over. Pour it. He's a widower with a shovel. We'll pave the doubt. Pour it. We'll pave the doubt. She had written down her whole strategies. She had written down her whole strategy and her whole contempt in a single line, and it now sat in a lawyer's file beside a video of her pouring and a recording of a sheriff reading her the very deed she had bet no one would enforce. Worse for Camille, far worse. Nadia's box also held a copy of an affidavit of easement abandonment that Camille had signed and recorded with the county the week before the pour, a sworn document falsely declaring the Bracken easement extinguished by non-use, filed specifically to clear the title objection for Ironwood Savings Bank. It was not merely a bad business decision anymore. It was a false instrument Sworn had owned for generations, sworn and recorded, and that is a crime. The public confirmation came at the Calder County Planning Commission on a Thursday evening in October, where Camille had placed on the agenda a request to ratify the Willowmere Preserve entrance improvements and vacate a superseded access easement. She did not know the affidavit was already in a lawyer's hands. She did not know Nadia had defected or that the email existed. or that the sheriff's reading had been transcribed. She stood before the commission in cream and pearls and made her case with the fluent, frictionless confidence of a woman who had never lost a room, describing the Bracken easement as an antique encumbrance long abandoned and the Willowmere entrance as a public benefit. Then the chair opened the floor, and a quiet man in a clean but unremarkable shirt rose from the fourth row and asked, so mildly the clerk had to ask him to lean toward the microphone, whether he might put a few questions to Ms. Ostrander for the record. He asked her, first, whether it was correct that Willowmere had sold lots to buyers before obtaining any lawful right to place its entrance across the easement. She said, with a touch of impatience, that serious buyers understood that axe matters resolve in a certain order. He asked whether she had directed the concrete to be poured after receiving written notice that the easement was recorded and senior. She said the notice had been from an obstructionist, and that she had relied on an obstructionist, and that she had relied on her own conclusion that the easement was abandoned. He asked finally whether she truly believed or recorded a pertinent easement could be extinguished by a developer's decision that it was old. And Camille Ostrander, who did not know the man asking, had defended 900 easements. His family had owned for generations, who did not know his phone, and a sheriff's transcript already held her words, looked out at an obstacle she believed she had nearly finished paving over, and told a public commission, on a public recording, that easements got moved all the time, that it was just a conversation and a check, and that old maps get repaved by people willing to pour the concrete. It was, nearly word for word, what she had said to him on the wet slab in August, and what she had written to Nadia the previous fall. The same throwaway conviction, repeated so often it no longer registered to her as a confession. Emmett thanked her and sat down and said nothing more. She had just narrated her intent, under her own name, in public for the third document in time. The case reached the Calder County District Court in February, and it was, by design, the least dramatic proceeding imaginable, because Miriam Kessler had built it to be inevitable rather than exciting. There were no ambushes and no theatrics, only the slow, rhythmic, unanswerable presentation of a truth that had been waiting in 11 folders for its turn to be seen. She laid it out the way you establish a right of record from the oldest and most authoritative evidence outward. First, the 1958 easement itself, certified from Book 214, page 61, 40 feet wide, appurtenant, recorded 9 years before the Falkland was ever subdivided. Then the unbroken chain of title showing that Camille Ostrander had taken her land expressly subject to that recorded easement, that she had, in the plainest legal sense, always owned exactly what she claimed the old man was stealing. Then the certified deed the sheriff had read aloud on the slab and the transcript of that reading. Then the harassment campaign, folder by folder, the $400 fee, the certified had owned for generations, the certified abandonment threat, the survey stakes, the surveillance truck, the 11-day gate, entered one after another until the accumulated weight of it filled the room. Then his family had owned for footage of the pour and the phone video from the slab. And then, in a silent courtroom, and through Miriam played the recording, and the county heard Camille Ostrander say that the entrance was hers and had been since the day she signed, that the old man just hadn't been told yet, that old maps get repaved. Camille's attorneys tried, at the midpoint, the only pivot available, that their client had acted in good faith, relying on a professional conclusion that the easement was abandoned, an honest developer, misled. It was not a hopeless theory. It survived exactly as long as it took Miriam Kessler to enter Nadia Brandt's document box, the sales spreadsheet dated months before lawful access, the FAQ script coaching staff to call the fraud Kleeplemai, the recorded false affidavit of abandonment, and the email in which Camille, having been told in correct legal detail that the easement was valid, had replied, "Pour it. He's a widower with a shovel. We'll pave the doubt." Good faith, the judge would observe, does not sell 61 lots 8 months before it invents the right to sell them, and does not swear a false affidavit to hide the defect from its own bank. The pivot collapsed. What remained was the ruling, delivered in the flat formal language such moments demand, that the easement recorded at Book 214, page 61 was valid, senior, appurtenant, and fully enforceable, that the recorded affidavit of abandonment was false, and was stricken and voided, had owned for generations, that the Willowmere entrance constituted an unlawful encroachment upon the easement and was ordered removed in its entirety at the defendant's sole expense. that the defendant had committed trespass, slander of title, and unlawful obstruction of a recorded right of way, and that judgment for damages would enter for the plaintiff, the amount of which mattered far less to the man in the fourth row than the single clause that preceded it. The lane is restored and shall remain open. The dominoes did not fall so much as detonate. Ironwood Savings, learning that the fully resolved access rested on a false recorded affidavit, called its $11.2 million loan within the week and moved on its collateral. The title insurer denied the entrance's coverage outright. The 61 buyers, their closings frozen and their promised gate now under a court order to be jackhammered out of the ground, retained counsel and joined the suit. The Willowmere Board. A board Camille had packed with allies, resigned in a body within the month, some of them, Emmett suspected, more frightened of the criminal referral than ashamed of the fraud. And the referral came. Miriam's file and Nadia's box went to the district attorney, who charged Camille Ostrander with recording a false instrument, theft by deception, and unlawful interference with an easement, and to the state real estate board, which suspended and then revoked the broker's license she had spent 3 decades building. Ostrander Signature Communities filed for protection from its creditors. Within 60 days, its assets, the model home, the half-built boulevard, the 40 acres of graded pad sites, auctioned off in lots to satisfy Ironwood and the buyers ahead of anyone else. She did not attend the meetings that ended her. She had by then stopped attending meetings at all. Emmett did not gloat. This surprised people who did not know him and did not surprise Gil Marchetti in the slightest. When a reporter from the County Weekly drove out, hoping for a triumphant quote, Emmett offered her a chair on the porch and a bowl of Roxbury russets, and said only that he had not won anything, that the easement had been exactly where it always was, and all that had happened was that a room full of people finally agreed to read it. The victory had a quiet, expanding tail. The 61 buyers recovered most of their deposits from the wreckage of Ostrander Signature Communities, and Emmett owned for them nothing, who had every reason to let them stew for cheering a woman selling his access, sat for an afternoon with their attorney, and showed him, without fee, how the true, lawful entrance could be built where it should have gone all along, so that 88 families would not have their gate torn out from under them a second time. Other victims surfaced, as they always do once the first one falls. A retired couple 2 counties over came forward with a smaller, earlier version of the same scheme. An easement Camille had abandoned out from under them years before, when they'd had no way to fight it, and Emmett drove out, read their deed, found their recorded right still sitting in the county books exactly where it had always been, and showed their lawyer how to enforce it. And the neighbors came too, 1 and 2 at a time. A man named Pruitt, who had parked the surveillance truck at the mouth of Cider Lane for Willowmere's pay, stood at the edge of the orchard, unable to meet Emmett's eye, and said he was sorry that he hadn't understood that he should have. Loms induced Dean. Emmett told him to come sit in the shade and try a northern spy, and that was the whole of the reckoning, because to a man who had kept a promise to the dead, the living owed nothing but their honesty going forward. Spring came the way it always comes to the orchard, grudging and then all at once, and Emmett Bracken spent it undoing the concrete by hand, as much as a man his age can undo concrete by hand. The court had ordered it removed at Camille's expense, and a demolition crew broke the great slab into rubble across 3 long days. But Emmett did the finish work himself, hauling out the last shattered cobble-stamped pieces in a wheelbarrow, 1 load at a time, each they owned for generations, raking the raw scar of ground back into a lane, spreading the good orchard soil he had been saving, seeding it in the cool of the evenings the way Marisol used to seed the bare places under the trees. Fee, it was Sakinery. He was clearing the last of the broken concrete from the shoulder of the lane, down near where it opened to the valley, when his rake turned up a flat cedar box he had never seen, buried a spade's depth at the foot of the copper beech, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with the years. Inside, dry and perfect, was a hand-drawn map of the orchard in Marisol's careful hand. Every tree by variety, the pump house, the spring, and Cider Lane running its full 7/10 of a mile to the beach she had drawn as a small, careful star. And, folded into the back of it, was a note she must have buried in some private hour he would never know about. Written in the last good summer before the cancer, in the round handwriting he would have known anywhere. The lane was never really about getting to the orchard, she had written. It was about the walk. Keep it open, and keep walking it, and I'll be at the end of it. Keep the lane. He read it kneeling in the new grass with the beech leaves turning silver in the evening wind, and he understood, finally and completely, that he had. He set the map back in its cedar box and buried it again at the foot of the at the foot of the tree, for whoever came after, and then he stood and looked back up the restored length of Cider Lane, the raw seed already showing its first green haze. Aunt had deuced him, and he thought about the two of them, the woman who had spent her whole life learning to sound like the truth, and the quiet people who had spent theirs simply telling it. She had come with renderings and a microphone, and the loud, portable, purchasable certainty of a person who believed the concrete made the right. She was gone now, her license revoked, her name a cautionary tale traded between title agents, and the easement had not moved so much as an inch to accommodate her, because that, in the end, was the whole of it, the thing his grandfather had known when he wrote it into Book 214, and Marisol had known when she drew her small careful star. That false authority is always in a hurry, always loud, always paving over the doubt it cannot answer. While a true right asks for nothing, announces nothing, and simply waits, recorded and patient, and exactly where it has always been, for someone unhurried enough to kneel down and read what the ground remembered all along.